Yeah, a quick word from me. I joined ACEA in the 1st of October. I came from another company, IBM, from another industry basically, but there I was the global smarter transportation director. So basically coming from a very quiet sector filled with artificial intelligence, innovation, but I focused the last 10 years on smarter transportation. And I felt that I wanted to move to the automotive industry because I wanted to be in the industry. And my personal goal is to make sure the industry is connected and is using artificial intelligence and all the nice things we had in the IT industry. And I think that's also the reason maybe why Mike and the other team hired me. So I have this goal, but a goal is not only a dream if you don't have a plan. So as soon as I came in, we created a plan, and that is the 10-point plan that we are going to talk about today. And for that, I want to give the floor to Mike Manley to talk about the situation and the plan.
Thank you, Eric Mark. And it's great to have you, by the way. So firstly, I just want to thank everyone for taking the time for coming today. My remarks are probably going to be no more than 10 minutes, and we will then open up for Q&A. When we thought about this, it really is a time for new beginnings, not just the start of a new year, but obviously the start of a new decade. And it's a decade when we expect a radical transformation of our industry, which will cover many of the concepts itself of mobility. And it's also the start of a new political term here in Brussels with a newly formed European Commission that recently came into their office. And as pointed out, it's also a new start for me as president of ACEA. I'm going to spend just talking a little bit about some of the challenges that are ahead of us and then turn to the Green Deal, which is, I think, the reason we're here today. Obviously, the strategic importance of the auto industry is not something that can simply be taken for granted because, as you know, not only do we generate a significant amount of trade, we also employ many millions of people, particularly here in Europe and around the world. There's obviously a growing wave of new technologies, trends and players, as well as environmental challenges that will transform the transport mobility landscape in Europe. And as you know, regulatory demands are stronger than ever. And in fact, 2020 is a landmark year with stricter CO2 targets for cars and vans, which are now starting to come into force. But our industry is many, many years old, and we're no stranger to change, frankly. And that's what we're now doing on a massive scale. We're already adapting by ramping up investments in cutting-edge technologies and reinventing both the vehicles and the services that we offer, as well as the nature of our businesses. Now, interesting enough, challenges are coming to a head when we're about to face what I think will be a downturn in sales. Now, European Union last year actually increased their registrations by 1.2% to more than 15.3 million units, which was the 6th consecutive year of growth, by the way. But all of the forecasts are now forecasting a slight downturn of around 2% in 2020, which will represent the first fall in sales in 7 years. And as you know, there is a general slowdown in the global industry with the US sales falling and also in China. Now, on top of that, as you know, there's an interesting and somewhat challenging geopolitical environment. And if we just turn to Brexit for a second, following the 2016 referendum, we're now at the stage where we are reaching the point of exit from the UK from the Union. And while it does give us clarity on the timing of the departure, and hopefully will avoid the possibility of a catastrophic no-deal Brexit, we now really need the authorities to swiftly engage in discussions to make sure that there is an ambitious trade agreement, a deal that I think maintains zero tariffs, facilitates enhanced customer procedures and ensures continued regulatory alignment between the EU and the UK. And as you know, the UK is very deeply connected to the manufacturing chain in Europe, and it's crucial that trade between the EU and UK remains free and as frictionless as possible. So let me turn to the Green Deal, and it's obviously going to be one of the biggest drivers of change, and that's the need to address environmental concerns. Indeed, The new Commission has made the European Green Deal the centrepiece of its work plan for the next years, with the aim of making Europe the world's first climate-neutral continent. And ACEA fully supports this endeavour, strongly believing that carbon-neutral road transport is possible by 2050. And we want to kickstart the new year with this new policy chapter with a solid contribution to discussions on how to reduce CO2 emissions from the transport sector in the most cost-effective way. And today we are launching our 10-point plan for the implementation of the Green Deal. And I'm going to just share some of the key recommendations for you. But Eric, Mark, I think everybody's had a copy of the 10-point plan.
Yeah, it's in the booklet you have. Yeah.
So I'm going to just touch on a few of them this morning. Firstly, and I think this is important, we believe in choice for all, and that means that technological neutrality, we believe, must be maintained to reflect the many use cases of our customers throughout Europe. And it's also essential, we think, to deal with the diverse requirements of all vehicle segments: cars, vans, trucks, and of course, buses. Now, secondly, a more holistic approach should tackle the use of vehicles in the fleet, and this will require a smart combination of efficient vehicles covering tank-to-wheel emissions, which obviously is the responsibility of our industry, as well as an increasing move towards low-carbon energy carriers to cover well-to-tank, that part of CO2 emissions. Now, we're fully committed to further lowering emissions of new vehicles, and we're striving to reach those 2030 CO2 targets that were set for passenger cars, vans, and heavy-duty vehicles, and we believe these targets should remain on a tank-to-wheel basis. Now, in addition, a well-to-wheel concept with split responsibilities should be applied post-2030, which will properly account for the performance of vehicles and energy carriers. Now, that brings me on to my third point, and that is a dense EU-wide network of charging points and refuelling stations must be urgently developed and deployed, and this is one of the single most important enablers for achieving carbon neutrality. Now, there should be an ambitious review of the EU's Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Directive to include mandatory targets for charging points and refuelling stations for the national governments with clear enforcement measures. Now, this review should take account of the specific requirements of the heavy-duty segment, as their needs differ greatly from passenger cars. Now, at the same time, we need to recognise that new low-emission technologies are expensive, and they are going to remain so for the foreseeable future. And to ensure that higher prices do not slow down fleet renewal, consistent and economically sustainable incentive schemes for passenger cars and commercial vehicles, we believe, should be put in place. Now, this will encourage swifter fleet renewal in all vehicle segments, accelerating the uptake of new technologies across the board. Now, last but not least, the transition to carbon-neutral transport must be well managed, taking into account its social and its economic implications. And indeed, mobility must remain affordable for all European citizens, regardless of where they live or their financial means. Road freight transport must continue to contribute to the functioning of European economies, and if the Green Deal is to be Europe's man-on-the-moon moment, it must also strengthen the EU's industrial base and the global competitiveness of its automobile industry. And that is clearly for the sake of all who depend on the economic viability of the sector, including the millions of Europeans employed by it. So just in closing, before we open up for questions, together with my colleagues at ACEA, I look forward to working to strengthen the competitiveness of our industry and to improve mobility at what will be a very transformative time. So again, thank you for coming, and we're going to open it up for some Q&A.
Okay, just before we open the floor for your questions, a reminder that this afternoon Mr. Manley is actually speaking as president of ACEA. So as such, we won't be taking company-specific questions, but all your questions on industry-wide issues are, of course, more than welcome. So with that in mind, if you could, yes, say your name and media outlet.
Yeah, I'm Benjamin Eva from the Business Daily Leco. 2020 is also the year of the average of 95 grams. Where stand the industry on that? There were a lot of papers saying that a lot of companies would pay fine this year. Can you confirm that? And or where are we on that?
So obviously 2020 hasn't come as a surprise to any of the OEMs, and as you know from the investments that multiple OEMs have announced, there's been a huge amount of R&D put into the development and what will become the deployment of fleets that OEMs believe will meet their particular commitments in 2020. Now, I know some reference was made to where 2019 ended and compared that to the 2020 targets, but I think a lot of that clearly was the balancing of inventory in dealer networks around the various countries to make sure that as OEMs entered 2020, they came in the best shape possible. And clearly it's going to be a year of multiple launches of low CO2 emitting vehicles, increased electrification in the fleets, and all of the OEMs that I have spoke to as part of my role as president are very much focused on the achievement of their targets. Now, where they end up at the end of the year, obviously, we will see. It's going to be a year of, I think, learning in many instances, and one where OEMs will have to remain agile to make sure that they can continue to drive towards the targets they need to hit.
You were saying about zero tariffs between EU and UK after Brexit, they hope.
Mm-hmm.
In these days, Trump is threatening tariffs over the car industry in Europe because of the digital tax that has been decided by some countries such as Italy, Great Britain, France, etc. Can you give us a comment on this?
Yeah, I obviously, like many people, read some of the recent comments that we've seen. I think it's a much broader question than just directed at the automotive industry. What I can tell you from our perspective is that what we need is a degree of certainty so we can plan our business. We're a long cycle business, and we need to understand what the environment will look like over a prolonged period of time. If you look at President Trump's track record, the ratification of the replacement of the NAFTA agreement has now happened. I think he's incredibly serious, as he always is, with regard to this, and I think if the parties involved approach those conversations and discussions in a serious manner, then it will be possible, I believe, for a amicable conclusion to be reached, and that's how I hope all parties do approach it, because clearly an escalation in tariffs I don't believe is in the benefit of anyone. Yes, hi.
I see that you have here on page 4 of the 10 points. You have the e-vehicle fleet by fuel type. I don't see hydrogen. I don't understand where hydrogen is. And when you are talking of infrastructure for refueling or recharging batteries, are you including also refueling for hydrogen cars? Because it looks like there's not much place for it. Is it something you are asking?
Well, so I'm going to broaden out the question, and you can obviously feel free to redirect me if I don't get to your answer. One of the very first things I mentioned is neutrality in terms of the technology deployed because of the different needs and the duty cycles of the fleets of vehicles that are out there. Today, when you talk about hydrogen in terms of hydrogen fuel cells, because of the cost of that technology, there's very, very limited deployment on the roads today. But clearly there are sectors that would respond from a zero emission perspective to a hydrogen fuel cell type emission propulsion system than they would, for example, to a pure battery electric. And as I said, it comes down to the duty cycles. But what's clear is, regardless of the route that you take, there has to be a significant build-up of the infrastructure. I saw a forecast recently that suggested that by the time, I think it was 2027, 2028, some 3 million electric charging stations need to be deployed. Public charging stations need to be deployed to cope with the forecasted increase in battery electric vehicles. It is also true that if you see significant increase in fuel cell technology, that hydrogen refueling stations would probably be in a similar position and would need to be deployed as well. Yeah. And I think that's why we've spent some time as an industry recognizing our responsibility towards the 2050 goal of carbon neutrality, and really spending some time with Eric Mark and his team to think about those things that actually need to be done to facilitate that transition so that we collectively can move forward with delivery of our responsibility. And this whole question of refueling, regardless of the fuel type, is one that has to really be addressed now.
Edward Taylor from Reuters. I have a question. Given in Europe there is a push, a regulatory push to lower CO2. This is not necessarily the case globally. What is the point of having lower CO2 in Europe if car makers are allowed to then sell much bigger, heavier cars in other markets? And what do you think that will do to the overall CO2 footprint of the auto industry? And how do you approach how do you approach this argument?
Well, actually, I think there's probably two ways of viewing what you have just said. Firstly, every key region in the world has plans to reduce emissions on vehicles. Some are more aggressive than others. Some will require large deployment of electrification. Others will use biofuels, for example. Some look at tank to wheel, others look at well to wheel. But there's no doubt every key region now has plans to reduce emissions. So I don't believe that you will see one region that, if you like, bears the burden for the entire industry. I think you're going to see every single year improvements driven by technology. What is also clear is that some technology may be deployed earlier in some regions than other regions, and some of that is about acceptance of the consumers, and some of that is about those differing targets that we talked about. But I have no doubt many of these systems are being developed for global consumption, not just for regional consumption.
May I add one thing?
You may.
Thank you. I think it's we all if you believe in global warming, then of course you need to reduce the greenhouse gases. And I think the European car industry, our members, are really working on that. And this might create a new opportunity to export the European cars across the world, making the whole world, let's say, a better place and less carbon emission, with less carbon emission. So we see this as a new export article where the innovations that probably start in Europe because of the targets and the wishes of the European brands to do so will create better cars that of course are exported all across the world as well.
You were going to ask a follow-up question?
Well, the follow-up question is basically, how does consumer choice fit into all of this? I mean, consumers seem to be enjoying bigger, roomier, unfortunately heavier cars. The trend towards the SUV seems to be an unstoppable one. How do you reconcile that with the ambition to reduce the footprint? And does the auto industry, because of consumer choice, risk losing the argument with the environmentalists?
Well, I think that consumer choice is clearly different in each of the regions. The drive, if you like, to heavier vehicles is not necessarily something that I would say I have seen in Europe. Clearly you've seen a movement to SUVs because of the utility that SUVs have given consumers, and that's been partly facilitated because of the significant improvements in SUV fuel efficiency, and all of the focus that the OEMs I have spoken to are looking at their entire fleet regardless of body type and regardless of size. And obviously it's a balance as we make sure where we can that we match consumer demand in each of the regions, and some of that means deployment of heavy electrifications in larger vehicles, and some of that means deployment of heavy electrification in smaller vehicles such as in Europe.
It's just a question on because I'm not an engineer, but I've read that the electrical engine has far less component in comparison with the traditional engine. This will have an impact on the industry and also on the wider on the industry, or also on the suppliers. Do you think that the industry is ready for that transition, and how much would this transition cost in terms of jobs?
You're absolutely true. There are a number of things that are at play in this question. So I'm going to broaden it out a little bit more. There are less components, and in some instances a more simple build for a heavily electrified vehicle than a traditional combustion engine vehicle. And clearly that's going to mean some displacement of labour over time as higher and higher percentages of vehicles become electrified. There are also numerous components provided by suppliers that will not be required, spark plugs obviously being an obvious one. So clearly there will be a reduction in output of some of those components that will affect not just the traditional OEMs but also their supply base. I've seen some reports in Europe that already indicated and have forecasted the potential impact on total jobs, which is very significant, and it will be significant because there will also be, to some extent, a migration of jobs to lower cost countries, because one of the other issues is that the cost of this technology, I mentioned in my opening statement, is not inexpensive and will not reach the levels of combustion engine for many, many years, and all of that needs to be balanced. So one of the things that we have talked about is a complete recognition of that is not an industry problem per se, that it is a broader problem than that, and investment in reskilling and retooling our employment population, our supply base, is a vital part of making this transition. And that is part of the 10-step plan that Eric Mark and ACEA have released today, and I think it's a very, very important one, and I'm glad you asked the question.
Yes, go ahead. Yep.
Hi, Mahi Lamshi from AFP. There's the Commission is thinking about maybe including the road transport into the ETS market, the European carbon market. What do you think about that? Would you rather that they stick to imposing CO2 targets for cars? That's on the CO2 side, and on the diesel side, they're still working on the targets that were set up and then cancelled following the ACEA decision. Are you getting impatient? Because I assume this has an impact on R&D and building new cars. So, what is standing on that?
Well, the first one, I think that a carbon trading system, in my view, is something that's very, very important, and I believe, though, it should be completely reviewed in the context of the 2050 goals that the Green Deal and the new EU Parliament are looking at, because I think, as all of these things, they need to be reflective of what you're trying to achieve, but I think they should be completely inclusive. Transportation, as you know, accounts for nearly 25% of all GHG emissions. And I think, given that scale and scale and size, it should be included in any trading scheme. With regard to diesel, my only comments really, I wouldn't say necessarily that I'm impatient, but what we have seen in recent times is significant swings in diesel take rates, which has really changed the balance and the mix of many OEMs' fleets, and in fact contributed to some of the increase that we saw in CO2 in 2019. It was also contributed because there was a continued movement to SUVs. So when we look to the future, as always in our industry, what we're trying to do is to assess two things. One is to assess how we believe consumers will move with the emerging technologies, and that includes, it's not just electrification, that includes, for example, improvements in consumption on diesel and traditional gas engines. And then, what will be the acceptance rate in terms of what they're prepared to pay for that technology? And that's why I believe 2020 and 2021 will, to a large extent, be 2 years of discovery. You know, each OEM, as I mentioned before, has very, very detailed plans of how they will comply with their targets for emission standards. Those things remain plans until the reality of each year and how it rolls out. That's why I think now that we have targets, they should remain as they are, and we should understand how collectively we encourage an improved take rate in some of the technologies that are required and being forecasted as mix for each OEM. Yes.
Voglio Salimbeni, Italian News Agency, Il Sole 24 Ore. On the sector consolidation, how many global companies able to survive there will be at the end of the story?
Well, as president of ACEA, what I am hoping to be able to do with my association is to make sure that we create a thriving industry. Some of that will require some consolidation, but I think many OEMs have proven that that adage that was around the industry in the past, that scale is the only thing that will mean you will survive, has not actually been true. And this concept of a global vehicle and global scale to some extent has now changed, where people begin to look, I think, more rationally at regional requirements and regional scale, which is why consolidation will still, and in my opinion, should still very much be a tool to make sure our industry remains healthy going forward. In terms of the number of OEMs that survive, the reality is your guess would be as good as mine. My job, and the reason I'm here today, is to create a very healthy global European OEM industry.
Hello, Derek Perrot for French newspaper Les Echos. French Minister Elisabeth Borne said that she thinks there is a problem with the 85 gram rules, and that the problem is the way it's made. It's linked to the weight of the vehicles, therefore the big ones can exceed this limit, and she said it's not a good incentive and we have to change it. Do you have any comment on that proposal from her?
I think it's interesting that people now are really looking in detail at how the various targets were developed and deployed. To some extent, a rearward view on something that has been established is not necessarily helpful unless it is used for the ongoing debate about how we achieve the aspirations that have been laid down for 2050. What I do know is, as I mentioned before, each of the OEMs understand what they need to achieve. Each of them have plans to achieve it. It's based on the existing rules. And, you know, as I said, 20 and 21, I think, are going to be years where we discover and we learn a lot more. But I do think it's useful that people are looking in detail at the rules and how they've been established, because there are going to be, as there are in all of these things, unintended consequences. And we talked a little bit about employment, for example. But the reality is, reducing carbon output is something that we in ACEA and all OEMs are heavily and hugely committed to, not just from each individual OEM sustainability targets, but also the level of R&D that has gone into new technology. You know, these are investments that are made over long periods of time, and you will begin to see in greater numbers those investments hit the marketplace. And as I said, we need to see how the market responds.
I think we can take a last question.
Yes, you may.
Yes.
Sorry for asking a second question, but I see that you are actually against taking into account the life cycle assessment as a basis for mandatory regulatory targets at the EU level. And I'm wondering how can you do this? I mean, it's clear that the Commission, I mean, when you take taxonomy, for instance, the taxonomy new regulation on green investment, it's clear that the life cycle is important there. I mean, how can you have green technologies, green investments, green cars, if you don't take into account the life cycle? I mean, if an electric car is based on electricity that comes from fossil fuels, you're not going anywhere. So why do you have this point in your 10 points here?
Well, firstly, we're not against looking at life cycle production of CO2. I think it is absolutely vital to look at life cycle production of CO2. What we are saying is that there are multiple industries and organizations responsible for life cycle production of CO2. And each of those has a role to play. Clearly, OEMs have a role to play from tank to wheel. Clearly we do. Our ability to, for example, in using your example of generation of electricity, OEM's ability to move the power generation industry from fossil fuels to wind or solar is zero. which is why there needs to be a higher body that looks at life cycle, and it needs to be, those targets and those ambitions need to be properly allocated to those that can actually action and deliver a life cycle result. We will be part of that and clearly have to be part of that, but we can't be that complete responsible for it.
Yeah.